Imagine a world teetering on the edge. It's the summer of 1914, and Europe, seemingly at peace, is about to unravel in a way no one could have imagined. In just a matter of weeks, the great powers will turn on each other, plunging the world into a war like no other. But how did it come to this? How did the assassination of a single man in Sarajevo ignite a conflict that would engulf nations? Today, we uncover the tangled web of alliances, ambitions, and rivalries that led to World War I. Historians call it the Great War, but the causes behind it were far from simple. This wasn't just about an assassin's bullet. It was about militaries building in secret, empires jockeying for power, and national pride swelling in every capital. To understand why millions of lives were lost, we need to look beyond the headlines and see the deep-rooted tensions that had been simmering for years. Was this war inevitable? Let's find out. It was a warm day in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were making what seemed like a routine visit to this politically charged city. Little did they know, the streets were full of danger. A group of young Serbian nationalists had a deadly plan, a plan that would send shockwaves through Europe. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, and his fellow conspirators were part of a group called the Black Hand. They believed that by assassinating the Archduke, they could strike a blow for Serbian independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They wanted to send a message. The Slavic people of the Balkans would no longer be ruled by foreign powers. What started as a nationalist plot would soon spark an international disaster. The morning's assassination attempt almost failed. Another conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but missed, injuring members of the entourage instead. Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded in the hospital, but as fate would have it, this change in plans brought him back into the path of Princip. Standing on the street corner, Princip saw his chance. He raised his gun and fired 2 shots that would echo through history. One bullet struck the Archduke, the other his wife, Sophie. The Archduke and Sophie died within minutes. Austria-Hungary was outraged, and the assassination quickly escalated into a diplomatic crisis. But what many didn't realize at the time was that Europe was already sitting on a powder keg. This single act of violence would set off a chain reaction, one that would drag the entire continent into war. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination, but this wasn't just about one murder. Austria had long been worried about Serbia's growing influence in the Balkans. With support from Germany, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding near total control over their government. Serbia refused. War seemed inevitable. And just like that, what could have been a regional conflict began pulling in the rest of Europe. Why? Because behind this assassination lay a complex web of alliances, militarization, and rivalries. The assassination was the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for decades. But how did a small conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia lead to a global war? To answer that, we need to understand the deeper forces at play: alliances, military planning, and the ambitions of Europe's empires. Next, we'll explore how these factors turned a spark in Sarajevo into the inferno of World War I. Alliances, entangling commitments. Europe in the early 20th century wasn't just a collection of nations. It was a web of promises, alliances, and secret deals. What was meant to keep peace actually laid the groundwork for disaster. Countries across the continent had committed to defending each other if war broke out. This system of alliances created a domino effect, ensuring that once one nation was attacked, others would quickly be pulled in. On one side, we had the Triple Alliance, formed between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This was a military agreement that aimed to protect these nations from their rivals. On the other side was the Triple Entente, consisting of France, Russia, and Britain. Though not as formally binding as the Triple Alliance, it was an understanding that these nations would support each other against any German or Austro-Hungarian aggression. But these alliances weren't just for protection. They were part of a much larger geopolitical game. Germany, in particular, feared being surrounded by enemies, with France to the west and Russia to the east. Germany's military leaders believed they needed strong allies to survive. Meanwhile, France, still bitter over losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, was determined to weaken its rival. These alliances weren't just defensive, they also created an intense sense of obligation. If one nation was attacked, its allies were bound to come to its defense. And this was exactly what happened after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, but soon Russia came to Serbia's aid. Germany, honoring its alliance with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia, and within days, the entire continent was being pulled into the conflict. Even Britain, which had tried to avoid being dragged into European conflicts, found itself unable to stay neutral. Once Germany violated Belgium's neutrality by invading it, Britain entered the war. The dominoes were falling quickly, and by August 1914, Europe was at war. What started as a regional conflict in the Balkans now involved all the major European powers. The alliances that were supposed to keep the peace had instead guaranteed that a small conflict would turn into a world war. The next question is, how did the military buildup, known as militarism, play a role in making this war inevitable? Militarism, the arms race and military planning. While alliances set the stage for a global conflict, the real pressure came from something even more dangerous: militarism. By the early 20th century, Europe was caught in a deadly arms race. Countries like Germany, Britain, and France were building up their armies and navies at an alarming rate. Leaders were convinced that the only way to ensure peace was to be prepared for war, and not just any war, but a fast, decisive one. Germany, in particular, was at the heart of this build-up. With its growing economy and technological advancements, Germany believed that to secure its place in Europe, it needed a military that could match or surpass any other. This led to the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy designed for quick victory. The idea was simple: defeat France in the west quickly, then turn east to face Russia before it could fully mobilize. Germany wasn't the only nation preparing for war. Britain had embarked on a naval arms race with Germany, determined to maintain its dominance at sea. Massive battleships, known as dreadnoughts, were being built at an unprecedented rate. France and Russia too were expanding their armies, each preparing for what seemed to be an inevitable conflict. This arms race created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, where every nation was wary of being left vulnerable. Militarism also influenced the mindset of European leaders. Many believed that war would be swift, decisive, and even necessary. Military strategies like Germany's Schlieffen Plan or France's Plan 17 were designed for quick strikes and swift victories. But these plans were rigid, leaving little room for diplomacy. The belief that war could solve Europe's problems was pervasive, and once the conflict started, there was no turning back. As tensions mounted across Europe, militarism played a critical role in shaping how nations viewed conflict. The massive buildup of arms and rigid military strategies made war seem not just possible, but inevitable. And when the moment came, these nations were ready, not for peace, but for battle. Nationalism, pride and prejudice. Nationalism, it's more than just pride in one's country. In the years leading up to World War I, nationalism took on a more dangerous form, as nations across Europe became convinced of their superiority and destiny. For some, it meant the desire for expansion. For others, like the ethnic groups in the Balkans, it meant the push for independence. These conflicting national identities added fuel to the growing tensions across Europe. In France, nationalism was deeply rooted in a desire for revenge. Since losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1871, the French had nurtured a growing sense of resentment and a determination to reclaim their lost provinces. For Germany, nationalism was about proving itself as a dominant force in Europe. A newly unified nation Germany sought to challenge the old powers like Britain and France, both economically and militarily. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, nationalism was tearing apart empires. The Slavic peoples, especially the Serbs, wanted independence from Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. This desire for self-determination clashed with the goals of the larger empires, particularly Austria-Hungary, which was struggling to maintain control over its diverse population. Serbian nationalism was a direct threat to Austria-Hungary, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a violent expression of that growing tension. The rise of nationalism wasn't just a political move, it was personal. It seeped into every aspect of society. Nationalists believed their culture, language, and way of life were superior, and that their nation deserved to dominate others. This sense of superiority contributed to the belief that war was not only inevitable, but necessary to prove their nation's strength. As each nation's pride grew, so did the desire to assert dominance on the world stage. Nationalism made compromise nearly impossible. When you believe your nation is destined for greatness, the idea of backing down in the face of conflict feels like a betrayal of that destiny. It was this mindset that helped push Europe towards war. Imperialism, global rivalries. While tensions simmered in Europe, the flames of conflict were also being fanned across the globe. Imperialism, the pursuit of colonies and dominance overseas, created deep rivalries among Europe's great powers. For decades, nations like Britain, France, and Germany had competed for colonies in Africa and Asia. These colonies weren't just sources of raw materials, they were symbols of national power and prestige. Britain, with the largest empire, prided itself on controlling nearly a quarter of the world's landmass. The French, too, had an expansive colonial presence, particularly in North and West Africa, but Germany, a relatively new empire, wanted a piece of the imperial pie. Tensions between these powers over territories, resources, and influence intensified as the 20th century approached. These imperial ambitions weren't confined to distant lands. They had real consequences back in Europe. Tensions flared, especially between Germany and Britain, as both nations sought to expand their influence. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, wanted a place in the sun and aimed to challenge Britain's naval and colonial supremacy. This rivalry directly fed into the arms race and the growing suspicion between the powers. Imperial competition in Africa also saw multiple crises, such as the Moroccan crisis of 1905 and 1911, where Germany and France nearly went to war over influence in North Africa. Each time, Europe managed to avoid conflict, but barely. The scramble for global dominance didn't just reflect competition for resources, it mirrored the growing distrust between the great powers. In the end, imperialism wasn't just about far-off colonies. It intensified the rivalries and distrust between European powers, bringing them closer to the brink of war. As these empires jostled for global influence, they set the stage for a conflict that would soon engulf not just Europe, but the world. The Balkans and the decline of the Ottoman Empire. At the heart of the growing tensions in Europe lay the Balkans, a region often referred to as the powder keg of Europe. Why? Because the Balkans were a hotbed of nationalist movements, ethnic tensions, and imperial ambitions. The declining Ottoman Empire, which had once ruled so much of the region, was rapidly losing control, creating a power vacuum. Both Austria-Hungary and Russia sought to fill that vacuum, and Serbia, driven by its nationalist ambitions, became a key player in the drama. The Ottoman Empire, often referred to as the sick man of Europe, had been in decline for decades. Once a dominant power, it now struggled to maintain control over its territories, especially in the Balkans. The rise of nationalist movements, particularly among Slavic peoples, further weakened the empire. These groups wanted independence, and many looked to Russia for support. Russia, in turn, saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations, which led to a growing conflict with Austria-Hungary, who sought to maintain its dominance in the region. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, Serbia emerged as a key player in the Balkans, advocating for Slavic unity and independence from both Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans. This created deep tensions with Austria-Hungary, which saw Serbia's ambitions as a direct threat to its own stability. With Russia backing Serbia, the region became a flashpoint for a larger conflict. In 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars further destabilized the region. The Ottoman Empire lost nearly all its European territories, and new, fragile nations emerged. These conflicts heightened tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, with both sides growing increasingly hostile. The Balkans became a battlefield for influence, with Austria-Hungary determined to prevent the rise of a Slavic-led state under Serbia's influence. The collapse of the Ottoman control in the Balkans set the stage for the crisis of 1914. Nationalism, imperial rivalry, and the power struggle between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, backed by Russia, made the Balkans a pressure cooker. All it needed was a spark, and that spark came in the form of the assassination in Sarajevo. The July Crisis, a diplomatic failure. June 28, 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set Europe on a dangerous path. What followed was a month of intense diplomatic negotiations, now known as the July Crisis. This was the last chance for Europe to avoid a full-scale war, but instead, diplomacy broke down, and the continent slipped into chaos. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. The terms were harsh, essentially demanding that Serbia relinquish its sovereignty. While Serbia agreed to most of the demands, it couldn't accept all of them. Austria-Hungary, seeing this as defiance, declared war on Serbia on July 28th. What might have remained a regional conflict quickly escalated as alliances began to activate. As Austria-Hungary mobilized against Serbia, other powers quickly took sides. Russia, bound by its alliance with Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany, fearing a two-front war, declared war on Russia on August 1st and then on France 2 days later. Britain, committed to defending Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4th. Diplomatic efforts to stop this chain reaction were either too slow or outright ignored. The July Crisis became a countdown to catastrophe, with every nation locked into its alliances and military plans. In just 1 month, what began as a regional dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia transformed into a global war. Diplomatic efforts had failed, not just because of miscommunication, but because of a belief that war could be won quickly and decisively. The July Crisis was the moment where peace could have been saved, but instead, Europe plunged into one of the deadliest conflicts in history. Could World War I have been prevented? Looking back, it's easy to ask, could World War I have been prevented? The answer is complicated. While the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the immediate trigger, the deeper causes, nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and the complex alliance system, had been building for years. The July Crisis may have been a moment where diplomacy could have stopped the war, but the entangled web of alliances and military plans made it almost inevitable. Ultimately, World War I wasn't the result of a single event, but a series of interconnected forces that pushed Europe toward conflict. It's a stark reminder of how quickly peace can unravel when nations fail to resolve their differences through diplomacy. The Great War's lessons echo through history, urging us to look beyond immediate causes and address the deeper tensions that can lead to global catastrophe. As we close this chapter on the causes of World War I, we are reminded of how fragile peace can be, and how the decisions of a few shape the destiny of millions. The roads that led to the Great War are the same roads we travel today, marked by ambition, fear, and the complexities of human nature. But history doesn't just belong to the past, it's the guide for our future. Here at Historical Corridors, we walk with you through the lessons of history. Together, we unravel the stories, not just to remember, but to learn. Because in the end. History's greatest question isn't what happened, it's what will we do next.